stand aside to show just how much we love you. And I'm sure you agree, commit more perfectly on the half of one party. The day you came to me, happy birthday to yourself. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Never understood how someone who stands for good could not have a day that would. He said, aside from the recognition, this should never be. Just because some cannot see, the dream is lazy. That they should make it become an illusion. They honor everything that they said but time will bring. In our heart we sing the Mandela and Martin Luther King. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. We know that there should be a holiday where peace is celebrated. You are the world. Tell me something new. Some people like me and you who know the way to truth is love and unity for all of God's children. Be a great event in the hope it should be spent. When the radiance of those who died for the wonderful people. So let us all begin. You know that love can win. Let it all know holding it. Be loud and dance with yourself. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. 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 Everybody say, happy
Hello, everybody. Good evening, beautiful people. Thank you so very much for giving of your gift of time. Please know that throughout all aspects of this national town hall discussion, neither me, the leaders within this organization, or any of the members of our distinguished panelists make the mistake of assuming that any of our participating audience members are empty vessels waiting to be filled by our knowledge. We are fully cognizant of that fact. And so as a direct result of that, that is the reason why we thank you for your gift of time, because we recognize that you could be doing anything for anything else with the next 90 minutes of your life, but you chose it to spend it with us. And I think I speak on behalf of myself, our founder and president, Reverend Jesse Jackson, when I say we are so humbled by your presence. With that being said, unfortunately, I can't think of any better time in our country's most recent history, and I do mean unfortunately, than today to engage in thoughtful and invigorating conversation about the extent to which we believe that Dr. King's dream has actually been realized as it relates to achieving the goal of equity in education. With regards to our organization, Push Excel, where Dr. Julianne Malveaux, you'll speak to in just a minute, serves as president. In November, we were thrilled to launch a new virtual town hall series entitled Shaping America's Education Agenda, providing all students with equitable access to a quality education is important to the vitality of this country. This series was designed as a springboard for helping to shape the future of our country's education policies. In an effort to accomplish the aforementioned goal, tonight we are launching the second event in that series, and it is entitled Seeing Dr. King's Dream Through. It is being held in honor of his birthday. And now I'd like to have you draw your attention to the brief PowerPoint presentation. Let me first begin reading one of Dr. King's quotes about education. He states, "At this point, I often wonder whether or not education is actually fulfilling its purpose. A great majority of the so-called educated people do not think logically and scientifically. Even the press, the classroom, the platform, and the pulpit, in many instances, do not give us objective and unbiased truths." And I think we can really relate with our most recent misfortune that in Dr. King's statement at the last part of this paragraph where he says, unbiased truths, I think we can relate to what he was stating then and recognize the fact that this has actually been evidenced in the recent attack on our nation's democracy, which took place last week at our nation's Capitol building. So this idea that unbiased truth, Dr. King spoke it when he was alive and well, leads to chaos. And the reality is that we're seeing evidence of that still today. He talks about the classroom. We're seeing evidence of that unbiased truths being displayed in classrooms, particularly as it relates to children of color entering classrooms with well-intentioned teachers and well-intentioned educators who are presenting them with curriculum materials that tell them that they don't matter, that tell them that people that look like them have made limited to no contributions to society as a whole. Again, this idea of unbiased truths not being existing during the time that he wrote this statement is still true today. Next slide, please. And so, his next quote: "To save man from morass of propaganda, in my opinion, is one of the chief aims of education." He states that education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence to discern the truth from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction. We're going to address that in just a few moments. You'll have an opportunity to address it as participating audience members, which I'm really excited about, and so will the panelists. We'll move on to our next slide, please. And so, speaking of education, it is absolutely important to recognize that as we begin to move forward, we can't forget the fact that this goal of working to achieve equity in education, we've got to stick with it, but it's not going to be easy, and it has never been easy. We are all aware of the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which was the 1954 decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled segregation in schools as being unconstitutional. And yet, as is evidenced in the next slide, even though the U.S. Supreme Court ruled it being unconstitutional for our schools to be segregated, we still had the case of the Little Rock 9 students who, because the defiance of the governor of Arkansas and those that supported the governor, what is evidenced is that these 9 students, known as Little Rock 9, had to be escorted to school. And so when we engage in conversation about seeing Dr. King's dream through, it remains inherently important that we come to terms with the fact that, again, it has not been easy and it never will be. Next slide, please. I'd like to provide another example of that. So we have the U.S. Supreme Court case in 1954, Brown versus Board of Ed. Just a few years later, we had the experience of the Little Rock 9. And then there's Ruby Bridges, who was the first African-American student to attend an all-white school in New Orleans. And what do we see here? She had to be escorted every single day to school. And so again, I know we're all up for the task. I know we're devastated about what occurred at our nation's capital, but the fight for justice has always been just that, the fight for justice. So in the words of John Lewis, let's keep this town hall going and let's kick off our shoes and plan to get into some good trouble tonight. Next slide, please. And now it's time to meet the leadership of Rainbow Push and Push Excel. I turn it over to Dr. Julianne Malveaux now. Panelists, I'm going to ask that you all go ahead and turn on your cameras. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's see here. Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I'm so delighted to be here. Dr. Whitaker has done a really great job of setting up our educational series. And as she said, there's no better time than now to talk about Dr. King's view of education and the deficiencies that we see in our system. We're at the cusp of a new administration. We need to make sure they understand what's important to us in terms of education. One of the things that literally my favorite Dr. King quote is from his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. He said, "I have the audacity to believe that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, peace and freedom for their spirits." Now, what's interesting about that, he put education right there with food, education right there with peace. Education was important to him. And with the quotes that Dr. Whitaker shared, he was very critical of existing education systems because those education systems don't teach. He has an essay that he wrote, beautiful essay that he wrote when he was an undergraduate at Morehouse that talks about people who are educated but not educated. In other words, only ignorant people are racist. And we saw that this week. Only ignorant people are racist. And he had a comment about, he said education was a defense to propaganda. So there were a whole lot of uneducated, you-know-whats out there. It was harrowing. And it wasn't just that they were at the Capitol, y'all. They were walking the streets of Washington, talking about whose streets are streets. And, so I almost went outside I had to go get something. My neighbor said, wait until tomorrow. Just wait until tomorrow. To talk about the agenda, what I want to, just a few things that we must think about if we're shaping an agenda. First of all, we have to talk about pre-K for all. Our young people come into preschool or come into kindergarten with already a vocabulary gap in terms of the number of words they've been exposed to. So pre-K for all is extremely important. President-elect Biden has talked about that. But the thing about candidates and talk is we have to make them do it. I remember, we have to make them do the work because they're not going to do it on their own. We, as much as excited as we all are, and I can hardly say excited because our VP is one of my homegirls, and just excited. But as excited as we are, we have to still do our work because the work is there. The second thing that I have on my list is rethinking standardized testing. Why should standardized tests be the gateway to college, the gateway to any number of other things? I don't think there's anything wrong with Black people's brains. I think we can learn and do standardized tests as well as anyone else if we have the same kind of prep that some other people have. You have people who are spending thousands of dollars on SAT prep when the average income of Black household is under $40,000? So who's going to spend thousands of dollars on SAT prep? I throw it away. We need early exposure to STEM fields. And there was Bob Moses, one of the great civil rights leaders, started something called the Algebra Project, because he said algebra was a gateway class. If you could pass algebra, you could basically do anything in terms of the sciences.
Someone needs, excuse me, someone needs to have Reverend put his camera on mute, please. Pardon my interruption, Dr. Malveaux. And someone, thank you very much. Go ahead, Dr. Malveaux.
Okay, we always make room for Rev. So the next thing that we must create access to technology. This COVID has let us know what the digital divide. I know Nicol, Dr. Lee will talk about this digital divide, but we must have access to technology. We must have an HBCU agenda, and more dollars need to flow to HBCUs. This is a very small thing, but Dr. David Wilson will identify with this. We must eliminate the 101 question FAFSA. It's the Student Financial Aid for. It has 101 questions. Now, a lot of young people and their parents are not going to fill that out. That's a barrier. And you could ask 4 questions. You could say, submit your tax return. But it's a small thing, but in many ways, it's a big thing, because we need to be careful to look at the ways that our young people are being sidelined. Dr. King had a keen eye for issues of inequity. And in that keen eye, he called it out over and over and over again. And so if we accept his challenge, we will call it out also. I'm not sure, except for our educators, that education issues are at the top of our agenda. I see people are talking about social justice, that's important. Police brutality, that's important. But the bottom line is education is the bridge that so many people walk over to get to a different life. Education is the bridge that people walk over to becoming, as Michelle Obama would say. And so we have to be education advocates, just like we're advocates for other things. We have to make sure our schools are clean, that our young people have adequate food, and that they know that we have their back. Dr. King talked about audacity. You know what audacity is? It's having the nerve. That wasn't necro, y'all. Having the nerve to basically say, this can happen. We've got to have that kind of nerve. And when we do it, I know my time is almost up or just about or gone. We have to look at issues of educational spending. The US spends only about 4% of GDP on education. So the education issue is partially federal, but it's also partially state. And so one of the things that, in terms of raising money for education, please look at your states, lobby your state legislators. This is why state elections are as important as national elections. Have a great conversation. I might pop back in. So, I have a habit of popping back in. I'll see. But anyway, thank y'all.
Thank you so very much. I wanted to pause for just a moment and see if Reverend Jackson wanted to give a few remarks. And if not, he can just do so whenever he's ready. Reverend.
How are you?
Hi, Reverend.
Thanks for another sermon from Julianne Malveaux. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Julianne. Dr. Whitaker, let me thank you for the work you're doing as an educator full-time, and the work that Reverend Dr. Jeanette Wilson is doing, and Michelle and Jason, our staff. But I'm convinced we must not deal with both the structure and the dynamic. We must have fair structure in that our will to education. We do what we will to do. I've seen kids play basketball in the mud at night, the tire rim, because they will to play ball. It's will to education the same way. And what we must do now, increasingly, is to make sure that we tie our Silicon Valley Bureau in with the education, because the education of the future happen to be, fast track of technology. So I want to thank you tonight for being a part of this, and let's do this often. Thank you very much. God bless you. Okay.
Thank you. God bless you too, Reverend. All right, Reverend Jeanette, if you wanted to offer a few words, if not, we'll move forward.
Move forward.
Thank you. Awesome. I'd like to, at this
I yield
point,
my time to the gentleman from Chicago, the Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson, and the gentle lady from DC.
love it. Love it. I'd like to have you meet our panelists at this time, our distinguished panelists, starting first with Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee. Dr. Lee is the director of the Center for Technology Innovation, Senior Fellow Governance Studies of the Brookings Institute. Dr. Lee is a senior fellow, again, in the Governance Study Department. She also serves as the co-editor-in-chief of TechTank broadcast for the Brookings Institution. She researches public policy designed to enable equitable access to technology across the U.S. and to harness its power to create change in communities across the entire world. Dr. Turner-Lee has a forthcoming book on the U.S. digital, that's exciting, on the U.S. digital divide entitled Digitally Invisible, How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. Wow. Thank you. Mr. Ralph Martire, who is no stranger to most. Mr. Martire is the executive director of the Center for Tax, Budget, and Accountability. Mr. Martire, in addition to that, he's very, very passionate about his work. He is committed to ensuring that state, federal, and local workforce, education, fiscal, economic, and budget policies are fair and just and promote opportunity for all, regardless of race, ethnicity, or income. Mr. Martire is also the Arthur Rubloff Endowed Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University and has helped obtain numerous legislative successes, including the passage of the evidence-based model of funding in the state of Illinois. And then we have Dr. Atiba, as I like to refer to him. He is the executive director of the National Alliance of Black School Educators, also referred to as NABSE. He is an educator with more than 36 years of experience, having previously served as a classroom teacher, as a building administrator, as a district administrator, and a university faculty member. At NABSE, he provides administrative leadership as the chief executive officer and the national spokesperson for the organization. And then we have Dr. David Wilson. Dr. Wilson is the president of Morgan State University and has more than 30 years of experience in higher education. He holds not one, not two, not three, but 4 academic degrees from Tuskegee University and Harvard University, including an EDD in administration, planning, social policy from the latter. Dr. Wilson has authored 2 books and more than 20 articles published in scholarly journals. Among the many recognitions and honors he has received for his work, he was named one of the nation's top 100 leaders in higher education by the American Association of Higher Education in 1998. And if that's not enough, he was selected as one of the Daily Records newspaper's influential Marylanders for 2011 and was honored by the University of Alabama with an award for outstanding leadership and engaged scholarship in April of 2011. And so when I say that we have an esteemed group of panelists with us tonight, that's exactly what I mean. Thank you so much for giving of your gift of time as well. I'd like to go ahead and pose my first question to you all, and then we're going to let it flow and do what comes natural. I want to go back to Dr. King's quote. Let me read it to you and I'll have you respond. If you'll recall, he said the following: to save man from the morass of propaganda, in my opinion, is one of the chief aims of education. Education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence, to discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction. And so this is a question I'd like each of the panelists to respond to. What do you believe, from your own perspective, is the purpose of education? Let your voice fill this airway. Okay, we'll go with Dr. Yes? Who's going? Oh, Dr. Wilson, go ahead.
Okay. First of all, let me express my appreciation to Rainbow Push for having this very important conversation about the critical role of education in this country and the fact that education must be the path to freedom. And I'm honored to be on the panel tonight with these distinguished panelists. When I think about the role of education briefly, I cannot think clearly about that without thinking about my own trek and my own path, because I had to struggle so hard to acquire an education that was transformative and that enabled me to pull myself out of abject poverty. And so as a result of that, I have brought to every educational setting that I have been a part of, from my current job as president of Morgan State University. Prior to that, I was the chancellor of the University of Wisconsin system and vice president at Auburn, et cetera. This kind of view that, in the words of Henry Brougham, education makes people easy to lead, but impossible to enslave. And education must imbue individuals with an endless thirst for truth, just as Dr. King indicated, and a clear ability to divorce truth from lies. And education also must imbue individuals with an ability to understand history, to understand different cultures, to understand the world. And if you do all those things, then I truly believe that at the end of the day, just as I have manifested this in my own life, the words of Horace Bond actually ring very, very clear. Education then is the great panacea. It is the way forward. It does create in one a mind that is not hackable. And when you have a mind that is not hackable, then I think education has done what education should do.
Awesome. Thank you. Let me get a next panelist to respond from your own perspective.
All right, so I'll jump in if that's okay.
Awesome.
Dr. Whitaker. So I'm Ralph Martire, and I'm always honored to be working with Rainbow Push and that organization's just standard commitment to creating justice in our nation's really always something that's great to be part of. So I'm honored to be here and honored to be part of your platform. I think when you look at education, everything Dr. Martin Luther King said, of course, was correct. But in today's world, it even goes a little further because it's directly tied to your economic viability in the modern economy. And the numbers here are staggering. So if you are a college grad, your earnings are significantly greater than if you're a high school grad. In fact, a high school grad only earns about 39% of what a college grad earns. If you don't have a high school diploma, you're only going to earn about 29% of what a college grad earns, which means if a student attending a public school doesn't have the type of education that allows them to develop the numeracy and literacy skills needed to be successful at the next level of education, they're going to be marginalized in the modern economy. So it really becomes a fundamental economic and civic right for every individual student in America, irrespective of their race or income, to receive a very high quality education from their public school. And when you look at the data and you look at the discrepancy between, let's just say, whites and African Americans in unemployment rates and income and all that other stuff, much of this can be explained by the institutional racism built into the funding mechanisms that govern K-12 education at the state level in most states in America. And I could pick on Illinois because I know Illinois a little better than other states. But in Illinois, when we passed the evidence-based funding model, one thing it allowed us to do was to look at how much money a school district needed to educate the students it served based on their demographics, their income level, et cetera. And what we found was the old system left significant gaps in funding statewide between well-funded districts and lower income districts, but those gaps were even worse along racial lines. So the typical white kid attending an underfunded school in the state of Illinois faced a per pupil funding gap between what their school needed and what their school had of about $2,495 per kid. The typical African-American student, $4,670 per kid, almost double. And that disinvestment in African-American students had gone on for generations. And so if for generations, your state funding mechanism intentionally underfunds schools for low-income populations generally, but for Black and brown kids specifically, you are creating disadvantage in your economic system, a structurally racist education system that can be resolved. And so the good news is we did pass the evidence-based funding model, as you mentioned, Dr. Whitaker. And since that model's been passed, it's been in place for 3 years now. And $980 million of new funding has gone into schools in Illinois under the model. 89% of that money, or $874 million, has gone to those school districts which educate 75% of our Black kids. So the model's actually working to reverse this significant disinvestment that's gone on for years. The bad news is, that's the good news, it's Illinois, so there's going to be bad news. The bad news is the state still underfunds K-12 education according to the evidence-based model by some $7 billion. So we've got a long way to go to catch up. And this year there has been no increase in funding, and the state's fiscal condition means next year there probably won't be either. And that's going to set back some of the gains that we are making here to reverse this institutional racism. So I think education is a core civil right, frankly, of everybody in America. And the educational system has to provide each student the opportunity to learn. And our educational system doesn't, in America generally, and in both states specifically, for most low-income kids and for all Black and brown kids. We just got to deal with that. There are ways to deal with it. It's time to talk about it honestly and solve the problem.
Thank you so much. Dr. Nicol, Dr. Atiba, I think you're ready.
Education for me is the great equalizer.
Mm-hmm.
The founding president of FRELIMO, the Mozambican Liberation Front, Dr. Eduardo Mondlane, stated that it was not until he was 12 years old he began anything like a formal education. The Portuguese made it clear that Black folks were not permitted to read and write, in the same way that the slave owners did in this country. Slaves were not permitted to learn how to read and write. The South Africans forced the Blacks there to learn the Boer language, which led to the Sharpeville massacre. So everyone other than us knows the importance of suppressing us from getting an education. Therefore, it's incumbent upon us to fight like hell, if you will, excuse my language to you religious folks, to get a proper education, because it is not only the great equalizer, but as Dr. Wilson said, it opens doors that otherwise might have been closed to us. The bridge that we cross to get over, in the word of Julianne Malveaux, is critical.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of poor folks, were it not for education, they would not have gotten to where they need to get. Part of the problem for us, however, and the challenge is that of all the major professions, we are still the most underrepresented, even though we work with most of our children. So when we talk about equity in education, it is painful. Brown versus the Board was 1954, 66 years ago. Martin Luther King gave his speech in 1963. 9 years after Brown versus the Board. And here we are in 2021, still speaking about and asking the question about equity. And it's a shame. We should not have to discuss this now, but it is what it is now, and we will move forward, and we will cross that bridge, and we will surely get over, as Dr. Malveaux said. Nicole.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
So I find this to be, again, a privilege to be on a panel, first and foremost, with all of these esteemed doctors. And and activists that are actually working in this space. And then two, I always give much love to Reverend Jesse Jackson. I wouldn't be here having the type of passion that I have as a young scholar of color, trying to make sure that our points get across from the intellectual side. So, I can't but agree with everybody and what everybody said, right? My grandmother was 15 when she had her first child, and my mother was the first in a family of 15 to go to college and get a master's degree. She was a member, a Dr. Atiba of NABSE, because she was an educator that worked from being a secretary into a learning resource teacher, and then she retired a few years ago, and she don't know what to do with herself because at the end of the day, she was an educator for life. That was her mission. In fact, sometimes my kids look at me and they say, "You're a grandma," and I'm like, "You're right," because I do believe with what everybody said, that education is one of the forms of the trajectory to social mobility. But I'd like to offer another opinion, particularly in the space that I sit. I'm a sociologist, so I look at things like education from a structural and sociological perspective. I mean, first and foremost, education is about book knowledge. Carter G. Woodson said, if you control a man's thinking, you control his destiny. So it's important for us to know our history and to know the history of others, to understand where we sit, so that our young people are not trying to figure out on what side of the history do they fall. So you have to have that knowledge. I tell students all the time, you got to know the whole context in which we actually look at systems of oppression, and we also look at American prosperity. So that way you begin to understand how history has been designed. I think it's also important, as my 99-year-old aunt continues to tell me, that you have to have street knowledge. So education is not just about book knowledge, it's actually also knowing what's out there and how do you actually navigate through the tunnels of life? What's your intuitiveness around certain things? As my older aunt used to tell us, you all may be smart, but you have no sense. That goes back to our ability to understand that regardless of the highest level of education that you can attain, there's just some people that still are out there acting very foolish when it comes to the types of decisions, particularly those decisions that advance the African-American and Latino communities. And then I would say, finally, and this kind of ties into my work, which is on technology, you have to have education because you need to know truth. Right now, we're in a stage where people believe a lot of what they read on the internet, what they actually pick up from other people that share through conspiracy theories. They begin to think that these false truths are what truths are about them. If I can go even deeper than that, what some of our young people believe about themselves, that they cannot achieve some of the greatness of the hidden figures of the women that actually took us to space. The fact that we had just last week people who believed that there was a stolen election in the context of voter suppression begins to tell you that we need to look at education in terms of what types of truths are we managing. And in the technology space, unfortunately, as we get into this conversation, the disinformation and the misinformation has taken over the book knowledge, and it's directed what I believe will become a civil society nightmare if we don't get back on the train of what education is designed for. I want to just say in closing, I appreciate what Ralph said, because people often don't understand that today's society requires more than just a high school education. It does require college, but I'll push it even further. In the technology space in which I work, it's not necessarily about young people becoming engineers. The Push Technology Project tells us that you can code, but you could also install the very wires and poles with some of the technologies that we're writing off actually avail themselves. And that comes to credentialing and certifications. So as we go forward in this conversation, I think it's very important that we look at education, Dr. Whitaker and Dr. Malveaux, from the standpoint of where do we place education within the ebb and flow of where society is going? And how do we ensure that when we're looking at the positioning of education for communities of color, that we're also leading with evidence and truth? And how do we use that education so that we can also dispel the continuous and persistent and decades-old attacks on Black folks and what we could not do and what we could not learn? And that's really important to me, particularly in tech, because we really do a really great job in the technology sector because of the whiteness of omitting the experiences or denying permissions of access in spaces that are not necessarily representative of us.
And if I may, Dr. Lee, add value to that, and then I'm going to pose a question. I'm going to pose two questions to all of our panelists based on a response that came from two of you, actually. And one of the things that I want to say in direct response to what you just said is you made a statement about where is education positioned For those of you who are on this panel and for the listening audience that are here for the very first time, I want you to know that this education series came about as a direct result of my concern for the fact that during the presidential election and during the presidential debates, that not one time was education a priority. And I never forget, and I said it on the radio recently, and I stated it at the beginning of the first event in this series. The title, Setting America's Education Agenda, came when the commentator of the second presidential debate opened up by stating, and with all due respect to her, because I thought she was phenomenal, but she stated, gentlemen, I remember it like it was yesterday, tonight, we are going to discuss the most important topic impacting our nation. And the education was not one of them. And so that's why we're here tonight. And so we're going to push Excel under the leadership of Reverend Jeanette Wilson and Dr. Julianne Malveaux, with my support, and the rest of the board are going to help shape the nation's education agenda, because it is indeed a priority. With that being said, I'd like to address this question. I would like to pose a question, but in addition to it coming from something that Dr. Nicol stated, one of the most powerful things Reverend said to me was, Black history is American history. Mm-hmm. You know, I must admit, I'm a little embarrassed because I don't know that I ever even thought about it that way. I know in February we have Black History Month, and that's the time where I get to really be proud of being Black. But when he said that, it really resonated with me. That Black history shouldn't just matter to Black folks. And so the question that I want to pose is, why do you believe, I'll give this one to Dr. Wilson. Dr. Wilson, why do you believe that it is important for people to know our history, including us? Why is that important from your perspective?
Well, yeah, first of all, it has to start with us. It's very important for us to know the fact that our history, particularly in the United States, did not start without the enslaved. And that has been perpetuated, I think, throughout the way American history is taught in high school. No, our history has started way back in Africa when slavery was not even a part of our vocabulary. And so if you are kind of starting from a point where young people, we are digesting the fact that we started as slaves, then you have kind of co-opted a little bit of their mind and thinking that they're not as whole as perhaps some other people, right? But that's the first. Now, as this discussion was unfolding, I really reflected back in terms of understanding your own history. I went to undergraduate at Tuskegee, and I had some amazing professors in the same way that Morgan State University has some of the most amazing professors today. And they challenge students the way my professors challenged me at Tuskegee. And so I went to class one day, and I had this amazing history professor, the late Professor Frank Tolan, and he never, ever had a book, but he knew everything in an entire library. And I opened my mouth and I said something, and it was quite apparent that I didn't know what the hell I was talking about. And I needed to spend some more time understanding myself and understanding our history. And he said, now, what's your name? I said, David Wilson. He said, young man. He said, look, I want you to go over to the Hollis Burke Purcell Library, and I want you to go to section E185 and spend some time there. I didn't know anything about E185, so I just kind of trekked over there, and I went to section E185, and that was the section on all of the scholarly books about Black folks, right? And it was just amazing. I mean, they had to put me out of the library because I just immersed myself in pulling down all of these books and reading everything from sociology to history to, it was just amazing. And so therefore, when I left that place, it didn't matter where I went from there. I had a really good sense of self. And so that's the first piece. And the second is we got to ensure that as universities hold up their so-called colleges of education, through which K through 12 teachers are coming, that those institutions must expose those teachers, who are in classrooms, to a way of thinking, to a broader view of the history of Black folk. Otherwise, they go into the classrooms and they're going to perpetuate this whole notion of stereotyping Black folk. And so it's enormously important that you know where you stand, because if you don't, you become like a feather. And the minute the wind picks up a little bit, you just kind of float someplace else. And then it picks up again and you float someplace else. And you're never anchored in one space. But when you know who you are, you're more like a cement block. And I don't care how hard the wind blows, it's not going to shake your foundation.
Absolutely.
Dr. Whitaker, I'm
Yeah.
going to jump in here for just a second.
Please do.
Because I'm reflecting on what Dr. Wilson had just said and thinking about the composition of those heathens who stormed the Capitol. Many of them were Southern. And my godchild, who's a brilliant young writer, he writes for USA Today, just graduated from Dartmouth a year ago. But I remember years ago, I had to Atlanta to threaten a teacher. That was because she told him that the Confederates won the Civil War. Then he repeated this mess to me. And I called his mom and said, but I mean, I was stuttering. And as y'all know who know me, I don't stutter on the regular. And she said, well, I'm going to go to the school, but I don't want to start a big confusion. I said, you don't have to start confusion. That's my godchild. I got this. She did not have the benefit, David, for E-185, but many of them don't have the benefit. So we have to start, and I smiled when you said E-185. I used to live there too. But we really have to start figuring out how to deal with curriculum to make sure that the curriculum, that you can't be a teacher. You can't walk into a classroom if you don't know anything about African-American history. I had a young man tell me I wrote a piece on reparations, and the editor called me and told me he didn't believe, this was about a year ago, he didn't believe that Tulsa had happened. I said, where did you go to school? He said, Yale. I said, have you ever heard of Google? He said, yes. I said, well, Google Black Wall Street. That's all you need to do for me. Don't tell me I have to prove it. It's a known fact, but they don't know. And Reverend is right. Black history is American history. We don't get past this until everybody understands what's happening. And it's not about wanting to get even, although we do know that both education and educational disparities lead to the wealth gap. But it's not necessarily about getting even, it's about getting real.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to continue this dialogue about the history piece. But before I do so, much like any town halls, people jump on sometimes halfway through. So I want to say welcome to anybody who just got on. My name is Dr. Sonya Whitaker. I'm the National Education Policy Director for Push Excel. And you just heard from Dr. Julianne Malveaux, who is our president. I also want to engage the audience. We're going to launch our first poll in just 1 second here. But before we do, I want to engage our audience. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A. So do go ahead and add your input to that. It's actually coming directly to me. If I don't read your question out loud tonight, we actually use the questions and the information we get from our survey to build our next series. So do provide that information for us. At this time, I would like to launch our first poll so that we can kind of get a sense of what our audience is thinking relevant to one question in particular. So can we bring that up now, and then we will continue with our dialogue. the first question for our viewing audience is, to what extent do you agree with Dr. King's statement that one of the chief aims of education is the morass of propaganda? To a great extent, a moderate extent, or not at all. So we would like for you to indicate. And this is just one small piece of his statement. So for those of you who just join on, I think you probably need a little more information to respond. The bottom line is that Reverend Dr. King felt, even though he didn't state it explicitly, that students should be involved in social justice issues and addressing issues that impact their community. They should be provided opportunities within the school day to learn about how to resolve those issues that matter to them. And so this poll again is about, to what extent do you agree? Oh, this is powerful. Let's look. I feel like you're actually here with us. 85%. And this again for my panelists, so you know who you're talking to. 85% of the people who are with us tonight agree with Dr. King's goal or statement about the purpose of education. Thank you so much. We will close that now. I want to engage an audience member question also. One audience member stated, how do we find educators when education is under attack? But I want to add to that, Dr. Atiba, you had mentioned, so remember that one. How do we find educators when education is under attack? But also, Dr. Atiba, you had mentioned the fact that we don't have a lot of Black and Brown teachers in the field of education. So I want to honor the panelists who took the time to pose the question, but I want to address both aspects of that.
Our organization, the National Alliance of Black School Educators, and Dr. Wilson, I just want to thank you. We have reached out to folks at Morgan State, and they've been willing to work with us, to partner with us with your School of Education. And I know one of the panelists is a student, a doctoral student at Morgan State, who asked one of those questions. So we should be working closely with the people in your School of Education to develop school leaders. Even though the field is highly segregated, there is no Black school district. I'm in New York. There's no Black district in New York. Even the areas where the majority student population is Black, the majority teacher population ain't Black, it's white. We are seriously underrepresented in the field. Folks sometimes look in those small districts in Mississippi and Alabama and they figure there's a whole lot, but we are underrepresented. We've got to make it attractive. Those of us who are educators have to be ambassadors for the field. We've got to let folks know it's a noble profession. We do good work, we change lives, we impact society. You know, everyone has been impacted by education. If you're an economist like Dr. Malveaux, you had a teacher somewhere along the line. If you're a sociologist like Dr. Lee, you had a teacher somewhere along the line. If you're a financial analyst like Mr. Marty, you had a teacher somewhere along the line. Teachers impact everyone. Doctors don't become doctors without a teacher. Lawyers don't become lawyers without a teacher. Astronauts don't become astronauts without a teacher. So we've got to sell the field. Those of us who are educational leaders have to sometimes, if I may parenthetically say, sometimes we are our own worst enemy. We badmouth ourselves, we badmouth our colleagues, and you wonder why folks aren't coming towards us. We've got to let folks know education is a noble profession. It is a desirable profession. And right now, we are partnering with a group of the 100 Black men to interest young Black boys to want to become educational. One of the challenges we've had is, how do you sell this to them? When they want to be rappers, ballers, and so forth, how do you sell education? How do you show that educators can make a decent living, to raise their families, and positively impact our society? Right. Yes, it was unfortunate, as you said, Dr. Whitaker, that none of the candidates saw the role or the importance of education. But I think we, organizations like ours, working with schools of education, working with the HBCUs, Dr. Malveaux talked about the importance of the HBCUs. We go back to the time when we weren't permitted to go to other schools. It was the HBCUs that saved us, that produced some of those great teachers that Dr. Wilson talked about at Tuskegee. We've got to go back and regenerate that, if you will, so that we can really build this field and educators are not looked at as second class, or those folks who did not major in education, those folks who do not have content knowledge, who couldn't find a job and figure, you know what, we offer the summer, we get a good pay, let's go and become educators. We've got to kill that mindset, and we've got to be discriminating. Don't just hire every warm body that comes to your school. Sometimes they do more harm than good. Make it not necessarily difficult, but as competitive, and also raise the pay a little bit. Give teachers a little bit more money so that they can be competitive with those in the other fields. You know, I mean, I look at my daughter, 27 years old, and she started off making about 3 times what I made when I was her age and I started teaching. Right. Yes, it was a long time ago, but even when you adjust for inflation, it was like, Daddy, you only made that when you were teaching? Yes, right. But I was able to raise you with it. But, you know, so
right,
you got to make it competitive.
Thank you. I'd like to add value for just a second and turn it over to Dr. Lee, because in addition to having Black and Brown participants, I know for a fact that we have white school district leaders that have come to this summit tonight, this town hall, because they want answers. And some of these, the white male and white female leaders that are tuning in, I know for a fact have expressed a concern about, especially during this pandemic crisis, and one associated with COVID-19 and the other one associated with racial tensions. All of a sudden now there's some more heightened awareness of the need to have Black and Brown teachers in our schools, and they're asking, where are they? The one thing that I wanted to suggest is that, and I know this from experience, one school districts were like, Dr. Whitaker, we've worked hard to recruit Black and Brown teachers and we can't find them. I said, well, where did you go? All white colleges? They're not there. The reality is that one recommendation that I would make, because I'm really big on recommendations, that if you're looking to engage hire Black and Brown teachers, start with the historically Black colleges and universities. Go to those job and recruitment fairs and make it a policy and a practice. But I have to add this, and I love the fact that I know this is going to rub some people the wrong way. I absolutely believe that Black and Brown children have to have Black and Brown teachers in front of them. At one point, I aspired to the superintendency. After having 4 degrees, I still never thought I could be a superintendent because I was only working in a white district. It wasn't until I went to a conference and they opened the doors and it was nothing but beautiful Black superintendents there. That's after having my doctorate, you all. It was only after seeing them that I thought I can really do this. So Sonya Whitaker really does believe that's important. But 80% of our teachers in America's schools are white females. What I think, in addition to having Black and Brown teachers, is that all teachers are culturally competent. Not just white teachers, because by the mere fact that we're educated, by the mere fact that some educators are middle class, there can be a cultural conflict based on our middle class experiences and that of the, say, 90% of the students that qualify for free and reduced lunch that we serve. So this idea of the need for training associated with developing cultural competencies, regardless of the ethnic background of the teacher, I think is really key. Dr. Lee, you wanted to add value to the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, you got me thinking about so many things. I'm going to add a couple of things. One, I want to talk to Dr. Atiba for a second, because I do have a young African-American son that wants to be a teacher. And I'm going to tell you why he wants to be a teacher. And it was one of those areas where my mother of 30 years of teaching said to him, you want to do what I do? After all these years and how much time and work and parents who like you and parents who don't listen. And she was a junior high school principal around NABSE with Dr. Moody and others. But this was the thing that he said to me. He said, Mom, I want to be a teacher because there were a lot of people who helped me get to this point where I'm a freshman in college. And let me tell you how important that statement really shook me. First and foremost, I think it's important that we as African Americans, and this is sort of the dissertation that I did when I was at Northwestern, is that we recognize that we have lived experiences that we do not transfer to our children. Why do our kids not know about history? Well, my dissertation found out is because we don't tell them about that side of it. Post the civil rights movement, it was all about our opportunity to get into white neighborhoods, white schools, and be in white corporations. And we forgot all those folks that actually had to march like John Lewis. We forgot a lot of people who had a lot of rejections. And we wanted to give, and this is actually genuine in my interviews for my dissertation, we wanted to give kids like myself who came post 60s the opportunity to compete. When I wanted to go to Howard, my parents said I couldn't go because they thought I would not study. So I ended up having to go to Colgate. Both of my parents went to HBCUs. Both of my parents were the first to go to college. Both of my parents are part of Black fraternities and sororities, all the way up to Eastern Stars and Masons. The cultural heritage that we missed out on post integration, post civil rights, really, I think, created a lapse where we have a group of folks in our community that don't feel that, okay, wear the dashiki in your household around your kids. My dad wore a dashiki in his household. That was his regular t-shirt. He either wore a Q shirt or he wore a dashiki. It was one or the other that he actually wore around the house. And I felt it was important for my own kids to allow them to understand that they are Black, and the lived experiences of where they go to school. We're in Fairfax County and Alexandria, they're public school kids, but they had to be a part of a Black church. They had to be part of Black organizations, and they had to balance the mix of friends that they have. I don't care who your friends are, but there better be a couple Black kids that come to the house every once in a while, Latina kids, somebody that I gotta see that looks like us. And I think part of what's happened with a lot of young people, we actually have taught them to believe that they live in a post-racial society and that opportunity skyrockets. And they don't see the importance of giving back the way that they should. And then when we go in institutions like Brookings Institution, and I'm not one of those folks, so I know I'm not talking to myself, we tend not to reach our hands back and bring in folks that need to be seeing what we do as policymakers, as educators, as economists, as corporate leaders, and allowing them that opportunity as well. Instead, we sit on the sidelines and we let other people make decisions around who's the intern, who's the next hire. And so I would actually put our community on blast. Unless you take that accountability and you go back and you see what Reverend Jackson and people before him did to get us to where we are on this Zoom call, we'll never have that cycle where we actually encourage our kids to become teachers and to give back. Like I said, I was very, very impressed by my son's ability to turn around and say, hey, I want to be a teacher. Now I'm gonna tell you this, I tried to get him to go to Morehouse too during this COVID pandemic, but we couldn't get down there for him to visit. So now he's at the College of William and Mary. But one of the things I had to say to him there too, you can't go to College of William and Mary without the agreement that you're going to join the Black Student Union or figure out what fraternities and sororities are there. That's how we live in our household. So I would just put that out there because I think that's the next generation of how we need to go back and remember collectively that our history is so much deeper than what we think it is today. That's the first and foremost thing. Then I would say to your point, Dr. Whitaker, and I think this is really important to say, because I'm not an educator by trade, I'm a sociologist by training. I think that we have to also be clear that COVID-19 does not take educators or educational institutions off the hook when it comes to the progress that we made in diversity. Before COVID, we had schools that were placing Black males as principals in K through 12 educational centers. We had people like yourselves and others that were recognizing the importance of having diverse teachers. We were not looking at harsh disciplinary tactics for young people prior to the pandemic. In fact, we were trying to address the disproportionate discipline of Black girls over everybody else in schools, if you all remember. COVID came, and in some districts, we threw all out the window. Now, we're looking at 50 million public school students that went home, had to get online. 15 to 16 million of them did not have home broadband access or internet or a device. 9 million of them didn't have either. And now McKinsey is telling us that Black kids are going to have 8 to 9 months of learning losses as a result of not being connected to school. Latinas about another 7 months, and low-income kids a year. So now if we're talking about Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, let's talk about Brown versus Board of Education in 2021, where kids are actually going to regress on their progress because we forgot about centering racial equity in education. Absolutely. In my work or what I do, I speak to educators, superintendents, principals, teachers, advocates all the time. We cannot sit back and allow kids to be offline or disconnected from learning. I have a 14-year-old who constantly comes out of her room, sometimes with tears because she wants to go back to school. And she gives me tears because I can't figure out how to help her because I gotta want to go back to work sometimes as well, at least get out of my house so I don't have to be the teacher, the chef, and the parent. But at the same token, think about the mental health challenges that our kids will also have coming out of COVID, but also looking at the traumatization and the normalization of violence that they've had to see on TV. So I would just say to all of the educators here, we have to go back to centering racial equity in these conversations. Absolutely. And we have to center it around what Dr. Atiba said and everybody else said. It's not just about, and I love the way Ralph put it, it is the economic distribution of resources. And if we have not solved that problem and we have technologies to actually help with that, then shame on us. But we also have to recognize that what we're starting to see show up, virtual truancy. I had the superintendents of Hartford School as well as Reynolds, Oregon, two teachers who have predominantly Latina or African-American districts. They said on this meeting that students have just basically fallen off the grid. They can't find them. Mm-hmm. They can't find them. And so the question becomes, how do we go back to those conversations? How do we go back and say, just because COVID happened, every child should have a laptop or tablet. Yes. Every child should have Wi-Fi access. I said to a school the other day, this is the last thing I'll say, I was talking to the Virginia Superintendent Association. And they said, but we have difficulty finding out where our kids are. Oh, actually, I was talking to my own school principal, my daughter's school principal. And
then I want to engage the audience.
I'm gonna be done.
Yeah, just because you're asking questions.
He made this comment that I want people to stick with. He said, we can't find families. And I said, we can't find families because we're not looking for them. And so I think it's something we have to go back. And again, I'm not an educator, I'm an advocate and I'm an activist. But I think it's important that we figure out how do we bring faith-based, community-based organizations, schools together to go back to centering racial equity.
Absolutely.
Could I just jump in for just a quick comment?
Absolutely.
And so I just wanted to connect with the comments that both Dr. Lee and Dr. Atiba made. And I would say this, Dr. Whitaker, you said there are individuals who are part of the webinar, superintendents or whomever, who are coming into this webinar saying, where are Black and Brown teachers? If you are interested in a possible partnership with Morgan State University, send me an email. Nice. And I'll be more than delighted to have that conversation with you. Famous author James Patterson, of course, had a deep interest in providing funding to enable Morgan and 2 or 3 more HBCUs to produce even more Black teachers and paid full tuition in order for that to happen. And we have some of the best teachers coming out of Morgan in the United States. I want to make that clear. Second, we've been a little personal, and I want to connect back with what Dr. Atiba said and also a little bit of what Dr. Lee said. I have a son who is at Morgan. And we grew up in cul-de-sacs. And almost every cul-de-sac in which we lived, we were one of only 2 Black families or the only Black family in the cul-de-sac. And he came through school, K through 12. And I look back on it and he only had 3 Black teachers. Now, he grew up in a house where his mom was a dentist and his father was the university president. So he was getting a kind of a Black experience and exposure just through the social networks and who we would have over to our house and all of that. But we went out to Wisconsin and lived out there, and then we moved here. And I thought he was going to go to Wisconsin. But we moved here when he was in the 8th grade. And this is the first time that we kind of we live right in Baltimore City. And so now, every day he is coming up to the Morgan campus. He is seeing Black folk in the main, in the vernacular, which way but loose. And when he applied to college, we went out to Wisconsin, we took the college tour. And as we were flying back, he was quiet and said, Dad, what do you think if I came to Morgan? And I said to him, dearie, I made the decision on my own as to where I wanted to go to college, and you need to make that decision. So you think about it, and whatever your decision is, I will support you. So he decided to come to Morgan. And after his first month, I said, well, look, let's go out to dinner because I'm interested in your experience. And so he's on the campus now. He rarely, if ever, he never comes by my office. And I mean, I see him on campus maybe once every 6 months or so. So he has his own life. But after that first month, we were having dinner. I said, well, how's your experience going, son? And here's what he said, and I hope he doesn't divorce me as his father. He said, Dad. I said, what? He said, you know, I never thought there were so many incredibly smart Black students.
Wow.
And I almost choked. I said, what in the hell are you talking about? So it's like, And now as he was about to graduate from Morgan, has this been the best experience of his life, right? Because we've been back to why is education important? Why is understanding your history important? Yeah, what's the difference between being a rock versus being a feather? So now he is a rock. And I don't have to worry about his well-being as a young Black man, and eventually a Black man my age. I don't have to worry about that because he has it. And so I think Dr. Atiba is right. We got to figure out a way in which we have to educate more Black teachers to go into the school system, and then more Black men to go into elementary education.
Yes, right. Right.
And I'll stop on that note, Dr. Whitaker.
And then I want to pose this next question.
Thank you. But that's so critically important, I think, for the topic that we're talking about today.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, kind of pulling it all together. I want to engage the audience. I have a question in front of me for Mr. Martire, and it actually came as a result of a statement that Dr. Malveaux made. And so this question, actually, before I do that, let's pull them in a quick poll. I want to bring up the poll where the audience can tell us to what extent do they believe that Dr. King's dream of equity in education has actually been realized. Let's see what the folks that have given of their time tonight believe. To what extent, participants, do you believe that Dr. King's dream of equity in education has actually been realized? Wow. 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 Does everybody see that? So remember, I started out at the beginning of our event today stating that the purpose of the event in part was to determine the extent to which we believe that Dr. King's dream has actually been realized. And well over 80% of the participants don't believe that that's the case. The question becomes, what do we do about it? And before I have that question answered, Mr. Martire, the question that has been posed and directed to you is regarding challenges to funding universal preschool.
Yeah, so there's a couple of challenges to that. One, while the federal government put some money into preschool, it puts it in through 4 or 5 different programs that have conflicting eligibility requisites, and it doesn't come anywhere near funding capacity. So then it really falls down to the states to make an adequate investment. And most states simply don't have the resources to do it. Illinois happens to be one of the leaders in funding K-12. We're going to put over $500 million, early childhood, $500 million into it this year. It's an 84% increase in real terms over where we were a decade ago. That's the good news. Here's the bad news. The actual demand for early childhood services in Illinois exceeds $3 billion. So we're coming nowhere near meeting the need. And I keep coming back to the dollars because I'm a simple person and I think capacity matters. And if you have inadequate capacity on the front end, you're going to get inadequate outcomes on the back end. And a lot of this comes down to resource and resource allocation. So when people have to, like in Illinois, we had an opportunity to raise new revenue from a fair tax initiative, and it got voted down because a lot of people didn't understand it. If state government doesn't have the money to invest in public services, here's what it doesn't have the money to invest in. 9 out of $10 every state government in America spends goes to 4 things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. And public safety is only about 6% of that budget nationally. So it's really the 2 biggest are education and healthcare. And despite that, education is woefully underfunded. So it comes down to being willing to raise adequate tax revenue to invest in these core services, number one. And number 2, to make the investments the right way. So if I can, Dr. Whitaker, go on to K-12 to tie it to this question, because we've identified in Illinois and in most state systems, I've done research covering most of the 50 states, that K-12 funding systems in their resource allocation are institutionally, structurally, whatever word you want to use, racist. They disadvantage minority communities and they advantage white communities. And that creates all kinds of problems from an economic justice and social justice standpoint. So that has to be remedied. But, fixing the problems with racism in the K-12 education system is going to be different from what the K-12 education system is used to dealing with. Because when the K-12 education system deals with a problem with a child learning, it's usually a child-centric problem. A low-income kid generally faces disadvantages to education that a non-low-income kid doesn't face. So the education system can identify what those disadvantages are, and it can invest in things like tier 2 interventionists, et cetera, to make up for what a low-income kid doesn't get at home and in their environment on average. So it's kid-centric. English learner. Well, we know what the problem is, right? The kid is learning the English language while learning in the English language. So we can identify interventions from an educational standpoint to help that student. A special needs student. Well, school districts are very good at putting together individualized education programs that meet the specific needs of the kid. Racism. Black kids aren't succeeding at the same level as their white peers, not because of an inherent disadvantage they face being Black. They are not competitive because the educational system itself discriminates against them. So it's not a kid-centric problem, which the system is used to dealing with. It's a system problem where the system itself is racist. So the system itself has to put in place reforms, identify the barriers, and put in place reforms that allow an African-American kid to get the same rich educational experience that meets her or his needs that a white kid gets. And the system currently doesn't do that in 99% of the cases. So what we need is to invest in fixing the system by doing an identification of the barriers and investing in those evidence-based practices that have been shown to address racism in educational systems, like implicit bias training and that is ongoing and evidence-based and gets embedded in the classroom, like culturally appropriate pedagogy. You and I have talked about some of the greats in this field, Dr. Whitaker, so we read the same sources. But there are ways to solve this problem. And what I'm very excited to say, because one thing you wanted to ask about is what we're doing now.
Right. And give me a minute on that, only because I want to go to that, and I'm glad you mentioned it. We are down to 11 minutes, and I feel like we just got started. And so I'm going to do the hard job of structuring what happens so that our participants get the fullness of what I know you have to offer. Okay. I know that Dr. Atiba, I'll give you a minute, and then Dr. Lee both of you had comments you wanted to make, and I want to honor you and give you a minute apiece to make those comments. And then I'm going to pose a question to everyone on the screen before we wrap up. How does that sound? All right, Dr.
I
Atiba.
speak rather rapidly, trying to get as much into the minute. I agree with the 80 or so % who feel that Dr. King's dream has not been realized. In 2011, the Obama administration created a commission on equity in schools. It was around school finance, but it actually went further. It had a lot of heavyweights on it. Chris Eardley co-chaired it with a co-founder of Netflix. Union people, Randy Weingarten was there, the president of the Urban League, president of the NAACP. Quite a number of individuals were there, but it was a commission that had some recommendations, but no teeth. What we need is legislation. PL 94-142, for those of you old timers who studied special ed, it was legislation for the children with handicapped children in education. Now it's called IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Act. It had very specific mandates for the states. Districts had to develop plans. If you were non-compliant, there were penalties. We need a similar legislation from Congress on issues of equity in schools, with metrics, with mandates about how you will arrive at those metrics. You must have a plan that is implementable. And if you fail to do that, there are penalties that can be levied against you. We can't expect people's goodwill or whims will get us where we need to get. Education is part of a struggle. As I said earlier, there's no accident that the first thing that people are denied is the ability to read and write, because as I think it was Dr. Malveaux said, or might have been Dr. Wilson, with an education, they might be able to capture you, but they can't enslave you, and I know I'm about 59 seconds, so I'll pause there, but there's a lot more we can say in terms of the.
Sure. Let me jump to Dr. Lee, and I'll come right back to you. Hold on.
I promise I'll be very quick. I want to just respond to what Dr. Martire said. But am I saying it right? Because I have very good R. Martire. I'm from New York, so my R comes out. So I apologize because sometimes I dialect. But I want to respond to what you're talking about in terms of the racism in systems and how we have to really unpack that. I want to say, as a person who I as part of my book, I went to 2 school districts to actually look at a school in West Phoenix, Arizona, that was predominantly populated by the children of immigrants who were always fearful of deportation. So every child in this elementary school had a cell phone. It was not for education. It was to be contacted by the parent. And then I visited a school in Marin, Alabama, the home birthplace of Coretta Scott King. T.D. Jakes actually grew up there. And there they had a one-to-one solution. It was a consolidated K-12 school that was about to be closed, but this highly charismatic principal decided a way to get this school together. 700 students, one-to-one tablet under the Obama administration's Connect Ed program. Both schools had it. I was so impressed by the fact that these kids carried a tablet under an arm and a pencil in the other and high-fived the principal out the door. But both schools were low-performing schools when it came to state scores. And it had me thinking when I wrote this paper about the extent to which we as or educators have not fully embraced the power of enthusiasm and motivation when it comes to starting to dispel some of the myths around that have been embedded in educational systems around racism. And it was funny because this was 2 weeks before the pandemic hit. And I remember I had the state superintendent on a podcast soon after who made the same thing. He was state superintendent of Alabama, said, we got great principals like Dr. Trimble, but her school is the lowest performing school in Marion, even though every parent in my tenure there came by to either get food from her. One parent said to me in the interview, because I was doing qualitative research, because of this teacher, my child did not drop out of school, my Black boy. And I went back to my colleague at Brookings who works in education policy. And I said, why is there this disconnect? Why is it that we've not been flexible enough in capturing, if we don't want to call it creativity, but capturing the enthusiasm that comes when we get our students and our teachers motivated and excited to teach kids that come from disproportionate backgrounds why is it that they still, when they get assessed by state standards, are still seen as low performing schools, despite the school in Marion graduating most of those kids to local community colleges and state colleges?
Dr. Lee,
I put that out to educators because I'm still trying to answer that. Yeah.
Dr. Lee, let me answer, and I'm gonna try hard not to start a whole nother conversation. I'm gonna give you 3 answers. Number 1, the tests are culturally biased. Number 2, our students know more than we think that they know, but because the state test does not match what the teachers are actually teaching, the test is the problem, not the students.
That's my point.
I'm just gonna give you the 2, and then
that's my point, and that's my point. I think if we're going to try to address racial equity, we got to start dealing with these assumptions.
And then number 3, that teachers of all races need to be taught how to connect the curriculum and the standards to the spirits and the lives of students of color. And when that happens, the neurons in their brains will expand and they will naturally connect to the content and reach their fullest intellectual potential. I'm winding up, but I think we're supposed to be winding down, right, Dr. Malveaux?
No,
Dr. Wilson and Dr. Martire, and then I'm gonna, at the end here, I'm gonna pose Dr. Atiba a question about hope. And then we're gonna go into our closing remarks, okay? Dr. Wilson, in 2 minutes, can you share with our participants any information about projects that you've been involved in or the work of your respective university that is being done that you believe moves us closer to addressing the equity issues that exist? Because as has been indicated, nearly 90% of our percent of our participants believe that Dr. King's dream has not actually been realized, but you all have been selected to be here tonight because you're doing the work. And so in 2 minutes, can you give us some examples of the work that's happening at your esteemed university to do so?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be dedicated to closing the educational equity gap. And as such, we are committed to producing a different kind of teacher who's bringing a different kind of perspective to K-12 to enable that gap to close. Second, I have to put that out there because I'm about to go someplace else with the second point. We have looked at how we close the wealth gap and how we ensure that our students are being prepared at Morgan to go into some of these disciplines where virtually there are no Blacks, but the salaries are just absolutely enormous. For example, like mergers and acquisitions, like asset management, like investment banking. And so as such, we have partnered with a number of Fortune 500 companies and are seeking to ensure that our students now are going to be on the cutting edge of innovation, and they're going to be able to break through some of these careers. Likewise, we have a center for fintech and cryptocurrency, the only HBCU in the country to do that. As a matter of fact, we have been given a several $1 million grant to train 35 other HBCUs to realign their curriculum in this space. And our students are just absolutely on the world stage now. They are investing, they're understanding this new currency. And then last, about 6 or 7 years ago, I went out to the Silicon Valley at the invitation, actually, of Reverend Jackson. He pulled together a group of the corporate CEOs from Apple and Intel, Facebook, and Google, and we had a closed door, serious conversation about what is it that you are not doing in order to have more employees who are Black. And basically, they didn't have a defensible answer. And that has led to a series of partnerships between Morgan and Intel, Morgan and Google, Morgan and Facebook, Morgan and Apple, but now we have a constant stream of students at Morgan who are going out to the Silicon Valley. They're getting these internships, they're getting these experiences, they're getting these offers. And so this is a way that we have to introduce them to closing the the equity gap with regard to economics as well.
Awesome.
So those are just a few of the things. Morgan is #1 in the U.S. in producing Black electrical engineers. We're #1 in civil engineering. We're #1 in industrial engineering. We are #4 in the United States in producing Black engineers in all fields. We are #1 in the United States with regard to Black females who
Right.
got an undergrad degree in engineering and who went on to get a PhD in engineering.
Okay.
They got their undergrad degree at Morgan, #2 in Black males. So in essence, we're doing what we can do at Morgan to make sure that we are putting our students in a position to grow the future.
Thank you
and
so
lead
much.
the world.
Thank you. We really appreciate that. Mr. Martire, I'm going to pose a question. I need to give you 2 minutes. And then audience, I'm told that our audience is still hanging with us. Pardon the use of comfortable terminology, but they're right here with us. Sometimes in town hall discussions, they're gone by now, but I just got great notice. We still are going to try to wrap up within the next 3 to 4 minutes, but I want my panelists to know they're still here. That's exciting. Mr. Martire, could you tell this listening audience and participating audience, before I go, I got one more poll for you, audience, so stay with us. Some information about one of the assignments or projects that you're working on right now that I think warrants mentioning before I turn the microphone over to Dr. Atiba.
Yeah, two quick updates. And by the way, the bias in the test can be overcome. We got to clean up those tests, but there's clearly bias in those tests. So we just have to fix that.
Yeah.
2 things we're working on. We, as technical advisor to the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus, actually just drafted an amendment to that evidence-based funding bill that I co-drafted a few years ago that passed. And it creates a specific funding matrix to invest in identifying and eliminating structural racism in K-12 education in Illinois. This is groundbreaking. This is not done anywhere else in the country. And it will provide additional capacity to school districts that have 15% or more of their student population African American to get this money, but they have to invest it in anti-racism initiatives, and that will impact 92% of the African American students in our state. So I'm excited about that, and we've talked a lot, and it passed. So woohoo! This is now the law of the land here. The second thing is, in collaboration with former Congressman Honda and current Congressman Robin Kelly, I am drafting a bill to be introduced at the federal level that would take the whole evidence-based model approach to school funding and implement it at the federal level. And it includes, by the way, this sub-funding element for identifying and eliminating structural racism. And we want to make this a federal priority. What would be different about the federal bill is it would also invest in facilities, and it would give the Department of Education the opportunity to either match new investments being made by states, or for those states that lack fiscal capacity. Mississippi's poor. 72% of the kids attending public school in Mississippi are low income. Mississippi doesn't have the revenue or the fiscal capacity to invest in educating its kids. So it would allow the Department of Education to invest directly in those kids and build those schools up to the level of funding that the evidence indicates is needed for their children to be successful academically. And all of it's tied into the evidence of what works, which is exciting. And it is the path forward. Fund what the evidence says works.
Awesome. Awesome. And so, what has been most amazing about tonight is that this group of panelists didn't just admire problems. We didn't admire problems. We indicated what they were, and what they are. And we provided, I hope you've got a ton of notes, because in my humble estimation, this group of panelists has done an amazing job of inspiring hope by offering comprehensive recommendations for what could be done to address the inequities that we have identified. I'm going to put my panelists on the spot and see if you know one of Reverend Jesse Jackson's biggest quotes. Keep hope what?
Alive.
Keep hope what?
Alive.
Keep hope what? Alive.
Alive.
And so panelists, I'd like to draw you in for one final poll. Do you feel that it is the responsibility of teachers to instill hope for a better life in America's most vulnerable students? To what extent do you feel it is the responsibility of teachers to instill hope for a better life for America's most vulnerable students? Now let's take a look at their responses. All right. 90% of our listening audience believes that it is important to instill hope. And so that is, again, what we hope to do. In 60 seconds, Dr. Atiba, and then I'll do the last 2-minute closing remarks. Can you share with us what? Yes, Dr. Malveaux. Yes.
Respectfully, I'd like to speak before you do.
Okay, go ahead.
For a minute, because you should close out, but I have a couple things to say, but let's get to.
Okay, after Dr. Atiba, no problem. All right, very good. Dr. Atiba.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
What's the question?
All right. Can you share with us to what extent you believe it is important? Why do you think it's important for teachers to work, given all that is occurring in our nation today? Why do you believe that it's still important for teachers to work to instill hope in America's most vulnerable students? And we can close the poll now.
Hope is tied to self-confidence. If you don't have the self-confidence that we expect for you to have, you're not going to do as well as you otherwise can do. Psychologists have shown us that motivation can really get people over those humps when sometimes they otherwise think that they might not be able to do so. Also, kids come to school with different levels of preparation. Sometimes they come to school with no breakfast, they have to walk in long distances. And if the person whom they meet in the school is not there, warm, welcoming, and inspiring, chances are they're not going to do as well as you otherwise would want them to do. So it is important for teachers to instill that self-confidence, not just hope, but a sense of self-confidence. Also to let them know that the teachers have their back, if you will, because without that, I can tell you, I've seen bad teachers. I've had bad teachers in my life growing up, a bad teacher. And among the things that teachers must do, Martin Luther King said it, they must inspire. Reverend Jackson called it giving hope. Others call it whatever they call it, but they must inspire youngsters to sometimes do better than they think they can do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those
Dr.
words.
Whitaker, before I disrespectfully, just one little caveat, just for the future, I think it's teachers. I think it takes a village. I really think that it takes a village from the point that the child leaves the home to the pastor, to the neighbor, to the friend. It's a village that raises a child.
Absolutely.
And as a person who's raised my children by myself, it's been a village in addition to teachers have done it. So I just want to put that out there. I know it's an educational panel and I was a minority, but it takes a community.
You're right.
Absolutely.
It takes a community.
Thank you so much for that. That does matter, Dr. Lee. Dr. Malveaux.
First of all, I want to thank you, Sonya, for assembling this panel. You all are really exciting. I mean, I'm sitting here. At one point, I said, well, I'll go upstairs and finish this paper I'm working on. And I said, no, I'm going to stay right here and listen to y'all. So all of you have a lot to say, and we really appreciate it. We may bring you back for a round two, depending on depending on what kind of participant feedback we get back to. We want to hear from participants. What we know is that we are in an educational crisis. We know that our young people have lost a lot because of COVID. One of the things that we used to do back in the day was things like Saturday schools. The churches would have a Saturday school to catch people up, but also to teach our history, because our history is not going to be taught in the public schools. I mean, when I was in the 5th grade, this was some time ago, of course, I went to Catholic school. The history book they had a sister there that looked like she had escaped from a Aunt Jemima pancake box. And this brother who literally in the book, he had 2 teeth and a hoe, like he was going to work. And that was it. I went home and I said to my mom, I don't know about this. And we had E185, David, in the house. So the first time I broke a bone climbing up the ladder to get a book. that I was told I could not read. So I climbed up there, got it, fell. But anyway, what I want to say is we need to think about ways to fill this gap, and we cannot depend on the government to do it. We want to get as much money as we can from the feds so our schools are funded fairly. Ralph, I admire the work that you do in terms of this formula that gets our folks done fairly. But some of you are in fraternal organizations, sororities and fraternities. We got to go back to the Saturday school. Monday through Friday isn't going to get it. So again, thank everybody. Thank you, participants, and turn it over to Sonya.
Thank you so much. And I'll close with 2 quick PowerPoint slides, which I think that are really, really important. 2 quotes from Dr. King. As we think about, again, we can't ignore all that's going on in our nation today. What I hope, even when we addressed the inequities in the system, that you come out of this town hall knowing that each of the participants and the president of our organization and the executive director of Push Yourself believed exactly what Dr. King said. Even with the attack on our democracy that occurred at the Capitol, the one thing that brings the panelists and us all together is that we all believe this: darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And then in the next slide, the final quote: whatever you do, we do not want you to give up. Again, 90% of us said that Dr. King's dream has actually not been realized. And so I hate to let you go for tonight because we have such a great bond, but the reality is that we all need to get back to our respective organizations and recognize, my slide just left me, and recognize that, let me give her a minute too, that if you cannot fly, then run. And if you cannot run, then walk. And if you cannot walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, keep moving. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Good night. Thank you, panelists. You're awesome. We're going to ask that our audience members for just a moment, if you're still here, and many of you, it looks like you are, please fill out this quick and final poll, and that will be followed up by a survey that will be given to you. We're going to get results in-house, but we want to make sure that if you are still online and you're our panelists, if you could please fill out this last poll, which states, overall, how satisfied are you with the experience attending Shaping America's Education Agenda on this night? Thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Dr.
Have an awesome
Whitaker.
night.
It didn't make much sense.
Night, y'all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Bring me a paper in this and I'll read it.
Yes, yes. I'll make sure we stay in touch. And Dr. Malveaux, I'll get in touch with you, okay? I got your stuff.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
And thank you all for staying,
Thank you.
guys.
I will.
All right, good night.
That put you down aside to show just how much we love you. And I'm sure that you agree. If it was perfectly to have a war party, the day you came to me. Happy birthday to yourself. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Never understood how someone who stands for good could not have a day that would. He said, aside from recognition, 'cause it can never be. Just what time will bring. But in my heart we sing the Mandela and Mark Luther King. God be